Malik never believed in the afterlife. He had heard stories, whispers of bright lights, tunnels, and voices calling from beyond, but he always dismissed them as the hallucinations of a dying brain. Science had explanations, and he was content with them. Until now. The last thing he remembered was the screech of tires, the sharp impact of metal on pavement, and the unbearable silence that followed. Then came the feeling of weightlessness, as if he had been lifted from his own body, drifting upward through an endless void. But instead of darkness, there was light, golden and endless, swallowing him whole. And then he saw him, seated in a leather armchair, dressed in a suit as if preparing for a courtroom drama or an intense interrogation, was Gene Hackman. His expression was firm, unreadable. The same legendary presence Malik had seen on movie screens was now right in front of him. But this wasn't Hollywood. This wasn't a script. "Sit down, kid," Hackman said, his voice steady. "We've got a lot to talk about." Malik hesitated, glancing around. The space around them was shifting, alive, visions flickering in the air like a movie reel unraveling in slow motion. He could see places he had never been, conversations that had never happened, moments that hadn't yet come to pass. "What is this?" Malik whispered. Hackman smirked. "A lesson. You're gonna see things. Truths most people ignore until it's too late." The visions grew clearer, sharpening into moments of political tension, betrayal, and collapse. Malik's pulse quickened. He wasn't just seeing history. He was watching it unfold before his eyes, and there was no turning back. Malik watched as the golden light twisted and coalesced, forming a vision of a television studio. At the center of the frame sat James Carville, the legendary Democratic strategist. His bald head gleamed under the studio lights, his Cajun accent cutting through the noise of political discourse like a scalpel. He leaned forward, his hands animated as he dissected the state of the Trump administration. "This White House is on borrowed time, folks," Carville declared, his tone a mix of confidence and amusement. "You don't need a PhD in political science to see what's happening here. The foundation is cracking, the walls are crumbling, and the roof is about to cave in, and the best part? They're doing it to themselves." Gene Hackman nodded, his eyes locked onto Malik's. "History doesn't repeat itself, kid, but it sure does rhyme." Carville understands something that most people overlook. Governments don't just collapse because of external forces. They fall from within. And this administration? It's eating itself alive. The scene shifted, revealing the White House in disarray. Leaked memos, frantic aides, late-night firings. It was a government at war with itself. Malik could almost hear the desperate whispers in the corridors of power, the sound of a ship slowly taking on water. Trump's advisors, once united in purpose, were now divided by ambition, paranoia, and self-preservation. Those who had once defended him were now looking for exits, and those who remained were sharpening their knives. Hackman leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his lips. Carville calls it a slow-motion train wreck. Every administration has turbulence, but this is different. The cracks aren't surface level. They go all the way down. And when the collapse begins, it won't be subtle. It'll be a political earthquake. The golden light twisted again, morphing into the cold, sterile corridors of the J. Edgar Hoover building, headquarters of the FBI. The floors gleamed under fluorescent lighting, and the distant echo of shoes on tile carried an air of quiet authority. But something in the atmosphere felt off. There was tension in the air, an unspoken battle for control. Malik turned to Gene Hackman, who was now standing beside him, arms crossed. "You ever notice something strange about the FBI, kid?" Hackman asked. "In its entire history, there's never been a Democratic director. Never. Think about that. The nation's top law enforcement agency supposedly impartial, has always been led by someone with ties to one side of the aisle. Doesn't that strike you as convenient? Before Malik could respond, the scene changed, revealing the face of Kash Patel, a former Trump loyalist now rumored to be in line for the FBI's top job. His name was spoken in hushed voices in political circles, controversial, inexperienced, and dangerously loyal. Unlike previous directors with long careers in law enforcement, Patel was seen by many as a political operative in disguise, a man placed not to serve justice, but to serve a single man. "Here's the thing," Hackman continued, his voice low but intense. "The FBI isn't just about chasing criminals. It's about controlling narratives. Imagine having someone like Patel at the helm, someone who doesn't see an independent agency, but a weapon to be wielded. What do you think happens to investigations then? Who gets protected? Who gets targeted?" The vision shifted again, showing a row of classified files locked away in a secured room. The initials DJT were barely visible on one of the folders. Hackman exhaled sharply. "This isn't about keeping America safe. It's about keeping secrets safe. If the wrong man takes over, you can bet those files disappear. You can bet that justice becomes selective. And you can bet that democracy takes another step towards something darker." Malik felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they painted was unsettling. "So what happens next?" he asked. Hackman chuckled, but there was no humor in his voice. "That depends, kid. Does the public even care? Or are they too busy watching the circus to notice the power plays happening behind the curtain?" The golden light shifted again, and Malik found himself standing in the middle of a news studio, its screens flashing urgent headlines. The energy in the room was tense, almost electric. Pundits debated in rapid-fire exchanges, while graphs and polls scrolled across the screen. At the center of it all, a single number stood out: 39%. Gene Hackman stepped forward, arms folded as he observed the chaos. "Look at that number, kid. You see it? That's Trump's approval rating. A few months ago, it was 53%. Now, it's falling like a brick in water. And let me tell you something about politics. When approval ratings nosedive like that, it's not a bad week. It's not a bad month. It's the beginning of a death spiral." The screens flickered, morphing into a Harvard poll breaking down the numbers by demographics. Malik's eyes darted across the statistics. White suburban voters, independent voters, even parts of Trump's base were abandoning ship. The shift wasn't just among hardcore opponents. It was happening within his own camp. "People love a winner," Hackman continued. "But the moment they sense weakness, they scatter like rats on a sinking ship. And that's exactly what's happening here. Those numbers don't lie. They tell you who's losing faith. And once that faith is gone, no amount of speeches, no amount of rallies, no amount of fake news accusations can bring it back." The image changed again, this time showing congressional offices where Republican lawmakers whispered behind closed doors. Some checked their phones nervously, scrolling through the latest approval numbers. Others avoided reporters, their expressions uneasy. Malik could almost hear their thoughts. How much longer can we defend him? How much longer before we jump ship, too? Hackman smirked. "See, this is where it gets interesting. When you're riding high in the polls, your party backs you up. But when you drop to 39%, that's when the sharks start circling. The same people who cheered for you yesterday start distancing themselves. They start using words like concerned and troubled. And then, one by one, they start turning their backs." Malik turned to Hackman, his mind racing. "So, what happens next?" Hackman's smile faded, his voice turning serious. "Next? If this trend keeps up, Trump's not just in trouble, he's finished. Because once a leader loses the perception of strength, once they start looking like a loser, the fall becomes Unstoppable. The numbers are more than just numbers, kid. They're a death sentence. The golden light swirled once again, shifting into a dimly lit war room where a group of Democratic strategists huddled around a long mahogany table. Maps, poll numbers, and reports were scattered across the surface, yet there was no sense of urgency, no frantic plotting, no desperate counterattacks. Instead, the strategists sat back, calm and composed. They weren't fighting. They were waiting. Malik frowned. "I don't get it. Why aren't they doing anything?" Gene Hackman chuckled, a knowing glint in his eye. "Because, kid, sometimes the best move is no move at all." He gestured toward the room where James Carville stood at the head of the table, smirking like a man who had seen this play out 100 times before. "We let him destroy himself," Carville declared. "We don't need to swing. He's swinging at himself." The vision shifted again, this time to Congress, where Republicans fought among themselves, struggling to pass legislation. News clips flashed across the scene, policy failures, infighting, and missteps. Trump's allies were floundering, yet the Democrats remained eerily silent. No aggressive attacks, no bombastic counter-strategy, just patience. Hackman leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "See, Carville's strategy isn't about making noise. It's about playing dead. Let Trump self-destruct. Let him dig his own grave. Why step in when your enemy is doing all the work for you?" Malik watched as the vision changed again, this time to a press conference, where Democratic leaders were asked about Trump's plummeting approval ratings. Their responses were measured, almost indifferent. "We're focused on the American people," they'd say. "We're not paying attention to the distractions." Hackman smirked. "That's code, kid. What they're really saying is, why should we waste our energy? The more they fight him, the more it rallies his base. But if they step back, if they let him trip over his own feet, the public sees it for what it is, his failure, not theirs." The scene zoomed back to Carville, pacing the war room, confident in his approach. "You don't fight a man who's punching himself in the face," he said. "You just let the world watch." Malik turned to Hackman, his mind processing it all. "So you're saying they don't have to win the fight, they just have to survive it?" Hackman nodded. "Exactly. When your opponent is in free fall, you don't have to push them off the cliff. You just step aside and let gravity do its job." The golden light twisted once again, reshaping into the vast chamber of the United States Capitol. The scene was tense. Lawmakers shuffled papers, aides whispered in hushed voices, and the air crackled with the static of political gridlock. At the center of it all, the speaker's gavel slammed against the podium. "Motion denied." Another failed bill. Another stalemate. Gene Hackman sighed, arms crossed. "You see this, kid? This is what political surrender looks like. Not with a bang, but with nothing at all." Malik watched as the chamber filled with frustrated murmurs. Lawmakers from both parties looked weary, their faces lined with exhaustion. They had tried over and over to move legislation forward. A debt extension, infrastructure funding, even basic governance, but nothing passed. Not because of fierce opposition, but because the administration itself couldn't unify its own ranks. Hackman gestured toward a cluster of Republican lawmakers, locked in a quiet but heated debate. "See those guys? That's the real battle. It's not the Democrats blocking Trump's agenda. It's his own party tearing itself apart. When you can't even get your own people to back your policies, you're not running a government, you're babysitting a mutiny." The vision shifted to a news broadcast. Headlines scrolled across the screen. "Debt extension bill stalls again. White House fails to secure. Party support, Congress in crisis. Legislative deadlock continues." A well-known political analyst appeared on screen. "At this point," he said, "it's not a question of whether Trump's administration will achieve its policy goals. It's a question of whether they can do anything at all." Hackman let out a low chuckle. Governments don't just collapse because of scandal, kid. They collapse when they stop working. When nothing gets passed, when nothing gets done, when even their own supporters start asking, "What's the point?" That's when the cracks become too big to patch. Malik turned to him, eyes narrowing. "So, what happens next?" Hackman's expression darkened. "Next? The people who backed Trump for power, for tax cuts, for influence, they start looking for the next guy. The moment they realize this administration isn't delivering, they cut their losses. And when that happens?" He motioned back to the Capitol, where another vote failed with a resounding nay. "That's when the government stops being a government," Hackman said, "and starts being a sinking ship." The golden light shifted again, and Malik found himself in the middle of a countdown clock. A giant digital timer loomed over him, its red numbers ticking down second by second. 30 days. The time left before everything falls apart. Gene Hackman stood beside him, his face unreadable. "You ever see an avalanche, kid? It doesn't start with a loud crash. It starts with a small shift, barely noticeable. Then the cracks spread. Then the weight becomes too much. And before you know it, it's all gone." The vision shifted, showing the White House in turmoil. Aides hurried through hallways, faces tense. Aides leaked stories to reporters. Aides jumped ship before they could be swallowed by the storm. The administration was spiraling, and the people inside knew it. A television screen flickered to life. James Carville appeared, speaking with an air of certainty. "I'm telling you, folks, 30 days, maybe 6 weeks. That's all they've got. Numbers are down, the scandals are piling up, and even the people inside the administration can see the writing on the wall." Malik's stomach turned as the scene zoomed into the Republican Party itself. Senators and congressmen whispered in closed-door meetings. Aides passed around internal polls, their faces grim. A Republican strategist spoke in hushed tones. "We need to start thinking about post-Trump." Hackman smirked, shaking his head. "That's the real killer, kid. It's not the Democrats. It's not the media. It's not even the voters. It's his own party looking at the mess and realizing, we don't need this guy anymore." The digital clock ticked down to 14 days. More resignations, more failed bills. The narrative was solidifying. Trump was no longer an asset. He was a liability. Malik turned to Hackman, his voice hushed. "So, what happens at 0? Hackman exhaled, watching as the clock hit World Trade Center. Scene changed. The White House briefing room, empty. The Oval Office, silent. A news anchor's voice echoed, "What we're seeing now is unprecedented. The Trump administration has reached a critical breaking point, and within the next few days, we expect major resignations, potential congressional action, and a fundamental shift in the balance of power in Washington." Hackman turned to Malik. "When an administration loses control of the narrative, when they can't pass bills, when their own people are jumping ship, that's the end. They don't have to be removed. They don't have to resign. They just become irrelevant. And once that happens, they're done." Malik felt the golden light pulling him back. His mind was racing, trying to process everything he had seen. And the people? Do they see it coming? Hackman smirked. "They always do. Just a little too late." The golden light flashed, and Malik's eyes snapped open on the operating table. He was back. Alive. But his mind was filled with knowledge he would never forget. The golden light flickered, its glow dimming as the visions around Malik began to fade. The countdown had reached its end. The whispers of backroom deals, collapsing approval ratings, and political betrayals all blurred into a single, undeniable truth. It was over. Gene Hackman sat across from him, watching with the calm detachment of a man who had seen this kind of downfall before. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Now you understand, don't you, kid? This was never about one speech, one scandal, or one bad poll. This was inevitable. Malik swallowed hard. So, that's it? Just like that? Hackman exhaled, nodding slowly. That's how it always happens. People think power ends in some big, dramatic explosion. But it doesn't. It dies piece by piece. A failed bill here, a lost ally there, and then one day, the people in charge wake up and realize they're not in charge anymore. The golden light began to pulse, pulling Malik away, back toward the world of the living. He could feel it now, the weight of his body returning, the distant hum of hospital machines, the murmur of voices on the edge of consciousness. But before he was fully pulled back, he asked the one question that still lingered. Why show me all this? What am I supposed to do with it? Hackman gave him a knowing smirk. Because the world isn't run by the loudest people, kid. It's run by the ones who see what's coming before it happens. You got a second chance. Now the question is, what are you gonna do with it? The golden light flashed. And then darkness. Malik gasped as his eyes shot open, the sterile glow of the hospital room replacing the visions of power and collapse. He was alive. But the knowledge, the truths he had seen, would never leave him. Because some near-death experiences don't just show you the afterlife. They show you the future.